Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Joshua Shanes. I'm associate professor here at the Yastik Arnold Jewish Studies program at the college and also the director of the Arnold Center for Israel Studies. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all this evening. It has been an exceptionally rich semester of events and it's not done yet. And I would just encourage you all to please check our website for dates and times of events coming up soon and the link we put in the chat for you. It is my true honor to welcome you to this year's Kronsberg Lecture. The Milton Kronsberg Lecture Series began in the fall of 1999 as a result of a generous endowment by the Kronsberg family. With the passing of Freddie Kronsberg in 2002, the series became the Milton and Freddie Kronsberg Memorial Lecture Series. The series honors the Kronsbergs' lifelong commitment to Jewish ideas and values. Many in the audience, I think, knew the Kronsbergs or know some of the family today. They were pillars of the Jewish community of Charleston for many years. Milton loved the life of ideas that is a central Jewish value and did not shy away from controversy. Freddie exemplified grace, charm, dignity, and a quiet self-confidence. The Milton and Freddie Kronsberg Lecture Series, appropriately named in their honor, is a wonderful way to remember them. The Kronsbergs' connection to Jewish studies is deep and continuing. Members of the family have served on the Yastik Arnold Jewish Studies Advisory Board. They've been regular attendees at our events, helped organize the SDT sorority on our campus, and served on the board of the Jewish Historical Society of South Carolina. I apologize, I'm going to blame Zoom for this one. I know there are members of the Kronsberg family in the audience. I apologize, I'm not sure which ones, but I just want to personally thank them for their ongoing commitment to Jewish studies and to Jewish life on campus. And now for tonight's event. Our speaker tonight is Professor Christine Hayes, the Sterling Professor of Religious Studies in Classical Judaica at Yale University. She specializes in Talmudic Midrashic studies. Her publications include 3 monographs, the most recent of which, What's Divine About Divine Law, won the National Jewish Book Award in Scholarship, the American Publishers Association Award for Religious Studies, and a Jordan Schnitzer Book Award. She has edited 3 scholarly collections, has authored 2 introductory volumes, The Emergence of Judaism and Introduction to the Bible, as well as numerous journal articles. Hayes is a senior research fellow with the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America and past president of the Association for Jewish Studies, our major scholarly body. I've also had the great privilege of working with her as a member of the AJS board, and it's really a treat for me to introduce her tonight for her lecture entitled, Where is Authentic Jewish Life Possible? The Land of Israel versus Diaspora in Classical Jewish Sources. Before we begin, I want to remind you the chat box is open, so please send me your questions as they occur to you, and I will gather them and collect them and be happy to pose them to our guest after the lecture. Welcome, Professor Hayes.
Thank you so much for that really generous introduction, Josh. And I want to also just thank Yaron Ayalon for the invitation to speak with you all and the Yastik Arnold Jewish Studies program in general. It's really a thrill to be with you. So in 2014, an International Writers Festival was held in Jerusalem. And at the festival, a young American Jewish writer, Nicole Krauss, was subjected to a somewhat aggressive and incoherent attack by an Israeli writer, Aleph Bet Yoshua, and it was described in the English language edition of Haaretz as follows. Yoshua totally rejected the possibility of leading an authentic and significant Jewish life outside the borders of this country, meaning Israel. He rejected in one sweep any non-Israeli Jewish literature, taking particular aim at the giants of American Jewish literature of the previous generation, such as Bernard Malamud, Philip Roth, and Saul Bellow. Yoshua claimed that he was unimpressed by them since they failed the test by not comprehending the grandeur of political Zionism and by not opting for it as the sole path for continued Jewish historical existence. End of the quotation from the paper. Now, mind you, Nicole Krauss was not an expatriate, an Israeli citizen who had abandoned her native country to live abroad. She was just a Jew. Like many Jews, her family has lived in another country for probably generations. So why should she be condemned for simply living where she's always lived? But for Jews like Nicole Krauss, the establishment of a Jewish state in 1948 raised questions that had simply not existed previously. Suddenly, they were told a place they had never set foot in was welcoming them home, which meant just as suddenly that the country they and their parents' parents had called home for centuries became something else, not a home, through no fault of their own, as a result of political and military events thousands of miles away. Many Jews after 1948 found themselves wondering, if the Jewish state is, at least in theory, my home, then what is my life here? Has living anywhere else automatically and unavoidably become a second best? Is living outside the land now, by definition, a less authentic Jewish life? Now, in fact, the question of whether an authentic and significant Jewish life is possible outside the land of Israel did not begin in 1948. The question is an ancient one. And this evening, we'll look at a variety of ancient Jewish sources from the biblical through the Talmudic period that offer different assessments of the land-diaspora relationship and different ideas of the place of the land and the place of the diaspora in the life and the destiny of the people of Israel. So we're going to begin with the biblical representation of the land. Now, the land is a central feature of God's covenantal promise to each successive patriarch. But what is it that God promises exactly? Does God offer an unconditional land grant or a conditional land lease? Well, we find both of these ideas in biblical sources. I'm going to share my screen. Let me collapse the picture on the side. Hopefully everyone can see everything on the screen. In some passages, the covenant seems to be an unconditional land grant in which God confers ownership of the land in perpetuity to the descendants of each patriarch. So to Abram in Genesis 12, then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring, I will give this land. To Isaac in Genesis 26, just reading the bolded sections, reside in this land as an alien. For to you and to your descendants, I will give all these lands, and I will fulfill the oath that I swore to your father Abraham. Then to Jacob in Genesis 28, the land on which you lie, I will give to you and to your offspring. And again, in Genesis 35 to Jacob, the land that I gave to Abraham and Isaac, I will give to you, and I will give the land to your offspring after you. And this land grant passes to the entire nation in Exodus 6, when God tells Moses regarding the patriarchs, and I will bring you into the land, unto the land concerning which I lifted up my hand to give it to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, and I will give it to you for a heritage. The patriarchs are actually described as aliens or sojourners in the land, but their offspring will truly possess the land and reside in it as a home, not as sojourners, but residents. But the idea of an unconditional land grant stands in tension with the idea of a conditional land lease. In Leviticus 25, God explains why it is that Israelites cannot permanently sell their own inheritance in the land to another Israelite. And he says, the land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine. With me, you are but gerim, aliens, and tenants. God retains clear title to the land and engages tenants whose residence is conditioned on following the house rules. God has evicted tenants in the past, and he will evict Israel too, he says, if the house rules aren't followed. This is the idea that lies behind Leviticus 18, where God says that the land will vomit out Israel just as it vomited out the previous inhabitants if Israel defiles the land with immoral deeds, specifically idolatry, bloodshed, and sexual immorality. It says in verse 26, but you shall keep my statutes and my ordinances and commit none of these abominations, either the citizen or the alien who resides among you. For the inhabitants of the land who were before you committed all of these abominations, and the land became defiled. Otherwise, the land will vomit you out for defiling it, as it vomited out the nation that was before you. So this is very different from the first text I cited. Here, the land has not been granted unconditionally at all. One more point to be made about the covenantal promise to the patriarchs is that the promise is not a promise of land only. The covenantal promise is a promise of numerous offspring as well. We see these two elements of the covenant, place and people, or the spatial and the social. We see this occurs in the promise to Abraham in Genesis 12 and 17. We've already seen the text where God promises the land, but here from Genesis 17, he says, I will make you the father of many nations. Also in the promise to Isaac. So now I'm repeating the text we saw before, but I've bold-faced the second half of it. Here he says, I will make your offspring as numerous as the stars of heaven and will give to your offspring all these lands, and all the nations of the earth shall gain blessing for themselves through your offspring. Emphasis on the offspring. And notice too, all these lands, plural, kol et kol ha'aretzot ha'ele. So this idea of producing many nations and expanding to other lands is even more explicit in the iteration of the covenantal promise to Jacob in Genesis 28, the last text on this slide. Here in verse 14, which is bold-faced, God says that Jacob's offspring will, quote, be like the dust of the earth and will spread abroad to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south, and all the families of the earth shall be blessed in you and your offspring. And finally, again to Jacob in Genesis 35, God tells Jacob to be fruitful and multiply, and then he says that a nation and a company of nations shall come from you, and kings, plural, shall spring from you. So Jacob sounds as though kings of various nations, not simply a dynasty within Israel, shall spring from Jacob. So side by side with the covenantal grant of the land to the Israelites, we find the promise of an expansion and dispersion beyond the land and an involvement with other nations that will bring divine blessings upon those nations. So what do we know about the land so far? Well, first, the promise of the land is described as both an unconditional land grant and as a conditional lease. And second, if we look more closely at the unconditional land grant passages as we just did, we see that at the heart of the covenantal promise lies not only the promise of a land, but also the promise of a people to fill a diaspora. Let's take a closer look now at what the Bible actually says about the land of Canaan, which will become the land of Israel. So certainly biblical texts glorify and idealize the land, it's true, but is the land intrinsically special and superior to other lands, or is its superiority dependent on something else? And here again, we find different answers. In Deuteronomy 8, the land is said to possess natural qualities of fertility and abundance. But a few chapters later, in Deuteronomy 11, it's very clear that the special qualities of the land are conditioned on God's providential care and Israel's moral state. The land in itself is just land. Its fertility and its abundance are dependent on God's will, which itself is a response to the tenant's behavior. Sometimes the land is said to be holy, kadosh, which in biblical Hebrew is a word that simply means set apart or separated to God. But the only intrinsically holy or set apart entity is God himself. God is the only intrinsically holy thing. God then imparts holiness to persons or places or things by setting them apart for himself, usually by having them observe special rules that no one else observes, or by taking ownership of them, like the sanctuary. Items that are brought into the sanctuary now God owns, and so they are holy, set apart for him. So God has set apart the land of Canaan, but in the biblical text, places outside the land of Israel can also be rendered holy if God has some connection with them or is present in them. So in Exodus 3, for example, when God comes to Moses in Midian, Moses must remove his shoes because the ground on which he stands has been rendered holy by God's presence. When God meets with Israel to give the Torah at a mountain outside the land, the mountain is rendered holy and it's off limits. No one can approach it. Holiness is conferred on a place by God's presence. It's also removed by God's departure. And so in Ezekiel 10, we have a very dramatic description of the destruction, and Ezekiel has a vision in which he sees God's departure from the sanctuary at the time of the destruction of Jerusalem and the first temple in 586 BCE. I'll share that text with you. In his vision, Ezekiel sees the divine presence rise from the sanctuary, mount its four-wheeled chariot, and eventually travel eastward with the exiles. And there, God says, he will be to the exiles, the bold-faced text here, as a small sanctuary, mikdash me'at, a small sanctuary or a holy place in the countries in which they are found, right? So it's a traveling holy space. As for life outside the land, the prophet Jeremiah conveys God's remarkable exhortation to the exiles after the first destruction to settle down in Babylon, to From verse 5, build houses and live in them, plant gardens and eat their produce, take wives and have sons and daughters, and take wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, that they may bear sons and daughters. Multiply there, do not decrease, but seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. In the continuation of that passage in Jeremiah, we certainly see that God's plan includes a future restoration to the land of Israel, to the land of Canaan, but only when the people seek God and find him in exile. In the meantime, this text asserts that an authentic existence and a relationship with the divine outside the land is not only possible, it's divinely mandated. So there's a tension, another tension then in these sources. On the one hand, there's a clear idealization of the land of Canaan as the site par excellence for Israel's co-residence with God. On the other hand, no land is inherently holy, and places outside the land can be rendered holy by the presence of God and can be sites of divine human encounter. This is a tension, it's not a contradiction. So we've seen that in the Bible, God promises both a place and a people dedicated to God's Torah. What is the relationship of the two parts of this promise? Is one an end, and the other a means to that end? In other words, is the land an end in itself? And is the people's obedience to Torah just a means to secure the land as a reward? Or is a people dedicated to God's Torah the true end? And the land is simply a means or mechanism to achieve that end? It's an interesting question. And in Deuteronomy 8, verse 1, Moses urges Israel to, quote, faithfully observe all the Torah that I enjoin upon you today, that you may thrive and increase and enter and possess the land which the Lord promised on oath to your ancestors. And in fact, many laws take that form. Do this, and you will live long in the land. Fail to do this, and you will be expelled. So in these texts, the land almost appears to be an end in itself, and the people's observance of the Torah is a means to secure that end as a reward. However, although residence in the land is morally conditioned, the reverse is not true. Being a moral people, meaning observing God's Torah, is not conditioned on residence in the land. Obedience to God's Torah is required of Jews wherever they live, as seen already in the biblical examples of Daniel and Ezra, who are faithful to God outside the land. So this would suggest that the formation of a community dedicated to Torah is the end goal. And while residence in the land may facilitate that goal, it's not actually a necessary or even a sufficient means to that end. This may be why dispersion to other lands is not always viewed negatively in biblical sources. Certainly when it's a punishment, it is negative, but some sources indicate that life outside the land serves a divine purpose. The two most commonly cited purposes for the dispersion are a desired transformation of Israel or a desired transformation of the nation. Deuteronomy 4 is a critically important text that sounds the first theme. The idea of the dispersion outside the land is important for the transformation of Israel. I love this text. I just think this is the most fascinating text, really of human psychology more than anything else. It's a great text. When you have had children, so God, Moses is speaking now, what's going to happen when you go and enter the land? Let me tell you what's going to happen, because remember, Moses in his farewell speech is warning them, you got to get along without me, so you better behave, right? You're not going to have me to plead for you when you build a golden calf or something. So here he's warning them. He says, when you have had children and children's children and become complacent in the land, the word here, it's like almost to fall asleep. You just fall asleep at the wheel. And you become complacent in the land. If you act corruptly then by making an idol in the form of anything, thus doing what is evil in the sight of the Lord your God and provoking him to anger, I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that you will soon utterly perish from the land that you are crossing the Jordan to occupy. You will not live long on it, but will be utterly destroyed. The Lord will scatter you among the peoples. Only a few of you will be left among the nations where the Lord will lead you. And there you will serve other gods made by human hands, objects of wood and stone that neither see nor hear nor eat nor smell. From there you will seek the Lord your God, and you will find him if you search after him with all your heart and soul. In your distress, when all these things have happened to you in time to come, you will return to the Lord your God and heed him. Because the Lord your God is a merciful God, he will neither abandon you nor destroy you. He will not forget the covenant with your ancestors that he swore to you. So in other words, as generations grow in the land, they will forget what God has done for them, and they will become complacent. They'll corrupt their ways. And the remedy for this corruption is exile. Elsewhere, Moses says, you're going to think that you earned this land because of your virtue. You didn't, right? Don't think you have this land because you're virtuous. So he's warning against that here. And they will corrupt their ways. And the remedy for this corruption is exile. For it's only in exile that Israel will be humbled and will once again seek and find God and return to the covenant, which will cause God to remember the covenant. So Israel's destiny is imagined here as cyclical, not linear, because it's only exile that brings recognition of God. Residence in the land brings forgetfulness of God. Residence in the land brings complacency, arrogance, corruption, as later generations enjoy the gift of the land without having labored for it and imagining it's because of their virtue. Exile is needed to humble Israel, Deuteronomy says. In exile, Israel rededicates itself to God, and God restores Israel to the land, but only presumably to have the cycle begin again. Exile is a vital reset button that recreates the experience of the forefathers. After all, God did not give the land directly to the patriarchs. They were resident aliens in the land. And before possessing the land, their descendants had to experience slavery in another land and an arduous journey through the wilderness in order to understand the value of the gift of the land. But again, as subsequent generations forget these lessons and arrogantly assume that they possess the land by virtue of their own righteousness, they will abandon God and worship idols and become corrupt. So the corrective of exile will be needed again and again. In Deuteronomy 4, then, the land is not a static point of arrival in a linear divine plan. It is one stage in a perpetual dialectic that passes from complacency and corruption to exile, followed by humility and repentance, then redemption and homecoming, only to return, presumably, to complacency, arrogance, sin, back to exile, humility, repentance, and on in an endless cycle. A second divine purpose that some biblical texts tell us can be achieved outside the land is the transformation not of Israel, but of other nations. So Isaiah 55, for example, depicts Israel as the faithful servant of God, whose loyalty in dark times broadcasts the knowledge of God throughout the nations. Isaiah says that Israel was chosen from the womb to serve God's universal purpose. As the mediator between the only God and the nations of the world, Israel is a light unto the nations, a familiar idea. So biblical land theology is complex with competing themes and emphases that will be important resources for later Jews laboring to manage the land diaspora dichotomy in the late Second Temple period and in the rabbinic period. The late Second Temple period is a time which sees the emergence of an unprecedented, widespread, thriving Jewish diaspora, especially in Alexandria, Egypt. And Jews begin to struggle with the questions we've already articulated. To what extent is the physical land necessary for an authentic Jewish identity and life? Or to put it another way, what determines an authentic Jewish life? The spatial aspect of the covenantal promise, life in the land, or the social aspect of the covenantal promise, life as a people dedicated to God's Torah? Well, not too surprisingly, writings from what is called Judea in this period, right? So now from the land of Canaan, we're now historically with Judea. Writings from what's called Judea in this period offer different answers from writings that come from people living in the Jewish diaspora. So in Hellenistic and Roman antiquity general, right, in this period, so 3rd, 2nd, 1st century into the 1st century of the Common Era, in this period, in general late antique culture, population dispersions were viewed in two different ways. Dispersions that stemmed from conquest and exile, forced exile, those were of course considered humiliating. But dispersions that were the result of voluntary colonizing effort were considered praiseworthy. And Jews made use of both of these ideas. Unsurprisingly, writings that stem from Judea view dispersion as humiliating exile, a punishment for the nation's sins. So we see in a writing known as Jubilees, probably the 2nd century BCE, we find these words, and I will hide my face from them, and I will deliver them into the hand of the Gentiles for captivity and for a prey and for devouring, and I will remove them from the midst of the land, and I will scatter them amongst the Gentiles. Or in another Hellenistic Jewish work, Tobit 3, for they did not obey your commandments, so that you have delivered us for a spoil and unto captivity and unto death, and for a proverb of reproach to all the nations among whom we are dispersed. So in these and similar texts, I could actually produce quite a few for you. Exile is a punitive alienation from God, far from being a light to other nations. Jews dispersed among the nations are being punished. They will be devoured like prey. Exile is death. By contrast, writers living outside the land portray the diaspora positively as an authentic locus of Jewish life and identity and relationship with the divine. And these writings employ the language of colonization and voluntary emigration that's so familiar in late antique society. So the Jewish writer Josephus, who lived out the latter part of his life in Rome in the 1st century, he radically recasts the Jewish diaspora as a voluntary colonization, and even more than that, as Israel's true divine destiny. Josephus de-emphasizes God's promise of a land at all. When he recounts the covenant with Abraham, Josephus actually omits God's 2 explicit promises of land. Josephus does note that God plans to bring Israel to the land of Canaan for a while, but the Israelites will not be confined to the land because the land is not really part of the covenantal promise. The heart of the covenant is the promise of a people, a promise of numerous progeny who will sire nations and fill the entire earth and sea. Josephus prefers the language of the patriarchal covenant as it was formulated to Jacob, where, remember, Jacob was promised offspring like the dust of the earth who will spread abroad on north, south, east, and west, and will give forth a company of nations. So according to Josephus then, what was promised to the people of Israel was not the land, even though God sends Israel there at one point, but precisely a diaspora. That's what the covenant was. And we see this in Josephus's famous and remarkable rewrite of the blessing of Bilam, from the book of Numbers. So you will recall that Bilam is a foreign prophet who is sent to curse Israel, but can only bless them. And here's what Josephus does, put these words that he puts into Bilam's mouth. You, Israel, shall be sufficiently numerous to supply the world in general, and every region of it in particular, with inhabitants out of your stock. Truly, the land of Canaan can now hold you, as being yet comparatively few. But know ye that the whole world is proposed to be your place of habitation forever. The multitude of your posterity also shall live as well in the islands as on the continent, and that more in number than are the stars in heaven. Through this foreign prophet, then, God indicates that he is sending the Israelites to a land from which they will then proceed to fill the earth and the islands of the seas. The diaspora is no calamity, it's the divine destiny. The land is but a starting point, and not a terribly important one at that. What has true value and permits the glory of the nation to shine is the colonies, the diaspora. And notably, Josephus does not in his writings speak of an ingathering of the exiles or a Messiah out of the house of David. It's the Jewish people's destiny to inhabit all nations, a process begun by Abraham, as Josephus describes in the second passage on this slide from Antiquities 1. First, he lists the 6 sons born to Abraham by Keturah. So Abraham, after this, married Keturah, by whom 6 sons were born to him, men of courage and of sagacious minds. He lists all their names, he lists their children. And then he says, now for all these sons and grandsons, Abraham contrived to settle them in colonies. He's using the language of the Roman Empire, colonies. And they took possession of various places, Troglodytes, the country of Arabia the Happy, Libya, Africa, and so on. So for Josephus, Abraham is the first colonizer, begetting numerous children whom he contrives to settle in colonies. The biblical promise of numberless offspring, which culminated in the promise of a land, culminates in Josephus's writings in the promise of colonies beyond the land. The Jewish philosopher Philo, who lived in the 1st century of the Common Era in Alexandria, Egypt, inserts a similar view of the diaspora when he discusses the biblical laws of Passover. So this is very timely. Numbers 9 allows anyone who missed the Passover because they are impure or on a journey far away to observe the Passover a month later. And here Philo writes, why are they allowed to do this? For those who are traveling in a foreign land, or, and he adds this to the biblical text, because the biblical text just says an impure person or someone who's far away on the road. But he says, for those who are traveling in a foreign land or dwelling in some other country, right, living in diaspora, they do no wrong so as to deserve to be deprived of equal honor with the rest, especially since one country will not contain the entire nation by reason of its great numbers, but has sent out colonies in every direction. So it's a matter of simple demographics. Such a small country simply cannot house and sustain such a large people. Life outside the land is inevitable and in no way wrong. But Philo actually goes on to make an even stronger claim. He interprets God's promise of the land allegorically also. This is one thing you may know about Philo. He likes to use allegory. And so for Philo, the promised land is actually an allegorical symbol for wisdom or virtue or knowledge of God, true communion with God. Now, Moses does not enter Canaan, as we all know. And Philo says it's because he had already attained the true land, the life of wisdom and knowledge of God. Philo explains Moses' death outside the land not as a punishment, but as a reward. The physical land of Canaan was given to the Israelites as a training ground for virtue, but those who have achieved wisdom and virtue like Moses need not enter. Moreover, it is not the only way to achieve knowledge of God. After all, the people encountered God most directly when they heard his voice and saw his glory and entered into covenant with him in a kind of no man's land at Sinai. Well, like these pre-rabbinic sources, rabbinic sources come to us, of course, from two localities, from the land of Israel and from, on the one hand, so those are the sources like the Mishnah and the Palestinian Talmud or the Yerushalmi and the Midrash. And then we have sources that come from the diasporic community in Babylonia. On the other hand, that's the Babylonian Talmud. And as you might predict, again, these two communities reflect different attitudes towards the land and towards the possibility of an authentic Jewish life and identity outside the land. So Palestinian rabbinic sources declare the central importance of the land, especially after the Bar Kokhba revolt, which was around the 130s, when a voluntary life outside the land was recast in the Palestinian sources as treason or abandonment. The delegitimization of Jewish life outside the land is seen in early rabbinic texts that put legal force behind the ideal of living in the land. So according to the Mishnah, a spouse, and in some versions, it could be the husband or the wife, can be compelled to move to the land and cannot be compelled to leave the land. And according to one tradition in a work known as the Tosefta, let's do this, yeah. In one tradition in the Tosefta, one should rather live in the land of Israel, even in a town where the majority of the inhabitants are Gentiles, than outside the land, even in a town where the majority of the inhabitants are Jews. So place is more important than people for Jewish communal life, right? And in case the point is lost, the same text goes on to explain that dwelling in the land of Israel is deemed as important as fulfilling all the commandments in the Torah. A little further on, the same passage stigmatizes those living in the diaspora as comparable to those who have renounced God altogether for, and I'm reading the boldface section, as long as you are in the land of Canaan, I will be your God, but when you are not dwelling in the land of Canaan, it is as if I am not your God. They derive this as an exegesis of a verse. The same passage ends with a climactic assertion by Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar that Israelites who reside outside the land are idolaters, even when they take pains, he goes on to explain, to live Jewishly and in accordance with God's law. These texts are remarkable for their implicit assertion that an authentic Jewish life and identity derives from physical location in the land, even if the land has become a non-Jewish space. Residence there is the mark of Jewish authenticity, while residence outside the land, even in a completely Jewishly inflected space, is inauthentic. In these texts, it seems that the spatial aspect of Israel's covenant with God trumps the communal aspect of the covenant, place over people. But rabbinic sources are inconsistent on this point, as they are on almost anything. So that almost goes without saying. And we see this inconsistency in the debate over certain agricultural laws. Does the obligation to fulfill these agricultural laws attach to the people, so that Jews everywhere, no matter where they live, must observe them? Or do these laws attach to the land, so that Jews living outside the land don't have to observe them, and Gentiles living in the land should? Are they communal laws? Are they spatial laws? Are they laws of the people, or are they laws of the place? Well, in the first 2 centuries of the Common Era, the land of Israel was, or at that time Judea, was increasingly populated by Gentiles, while Jews were living by the tens of thousands outside the land, creating a messy reality in which the holy people and the holy land did not map onto one another. So the rabbis had to decide which takes precedence in these various agricultural laws, the land or the people. And as I noted, they weren't consistent. Some agricultural laws are required only by those living in the land, attaching Torah observance to the land rather than the people. But other agricultural laws are required of Jews even when they live outside the land, suggesting that living a Jewish life is a function of the community within which one resides, rather than the ground on which one resides. So there is a tension between the Holy Land and the holy people, precisely because they are not congruent. And the law is worked out in individual cases in a very ad hoc way. Now, the delegitimization of life lived outside the land continues in Palestinian rabbinic texts that depict the exile in purely negative terms and as a punishment for sin. So in this passage from Lamentations Rabbah, this passage dismisses the view that we saw in Jeremiah and Philo and Josephus that Jews can settle down and thrive in the diaspora. The argument here is that Jews are different from other peoples. In the case of other nations, and I'm reading the bold-faced part of the first text, other nations, their exile is not real exile because they can make a home anywhere, is the argument. But Israel, who do not eat their bread, the bread of Gentiles, or drink their wine, the wine of Gentiles, they do experience real exile. Right? And according to this text, Jews are unique in their inability to feel at home anywhere but in their own land, because they cannot eat the local food or drink the local wine. The Palestinian Talmud, Yerushalmi, contains an extended reflection on the virtue not only of residing in the land, but dying in the land. The dead in the land will be the first to be resurrected in the Messianic period. And here a Babylonian sage, Ulla, is depicted as lamenting the fact that he is going to die in exile. So he was from the land of Israel, but he had emigrated to Babel, to Babylonia, and now he's dying, and he's lamenting the fact that he's going to die there. And they comfort him that his body can be buried in Israel. He says, no, to losing one's soul in a mother's bosom is not the same as losing it in the bosom of a foreigner. Right? So Babylonia is like being in a foreign woman's arms instead of your mother, which is the land of Israel. So much for the Palestinian rabbinic sources. What do we find in the Babylonian Talmud, or the Bavli? Well, the Bavli is much more conflicted, as we see in a very, very lengthy passage at the end of Tractate Ketubot. It goes on for almost three whole dapim, double-sided pages. But the passage opens and closes with a cluster of pro-land traditions that are the same or very similar to things that we see in the Palestinian sources. So we have a tradition from Rabbi Elazar: whoever is domiciled in the land of Israel lives without sin, and he gives a verse to prove it. Rabbi Anan says whoever is buried in the land of Israel is deemed to be buried under the altar, and he provides a verse to prove it. And then at the end of the passage, we find things like a statement by Rabbi Elazar that the dead outside the land will not be resurrected, or this statement by Rabbi Yochanan: whoever walks 4 cubits in the land of Israel is assured of a place in the world to come. And in the most explicit statement of the indispensable nature of the land, Rabbi Abahu is reported as saying, even a Canaanite bondwoman. So you need to know that a Canaanite bondwoman is, in rabbinic thinking, the lowest of the low. She is non-Jewish, but not just non-Jewish, Canaanite, which is really a hated people. And she is female, of course, and she is a bondwoman. She's a slave. So it's really the lowest status possible. But even a Canaanite bondwoman who lives in the land of Israel is assured of a place in the world to come. So residence also takes priority over the fundamental commandment to be fruitful and multiply, as we learn from the story about a man who remained unmarried rather than leave the land in order to marry a particular woman. So the long passage in Tractate Ketubot ends with hyperbolic expressions of the love that certain sages feel towards the land. They kiss its cliffs and they roll themselves in its dust and so on. So the passage has a lot of opening and closing pro-land statements. But between these opening and closing pro-land statements are traditions in which the status of the Holy Land is contested, particularly its status vis-a-vis Babylonia. Babylonia is elevated to a status that is sometimes just second to, sometimes equal to, and sometimes superior to that of the Holy Land. And so Rabbi Huda teaches that whoever goes up to the land of Israel from Babylon transgresses a positive commandment, since it is God who will effect the restoration of the exiles. The two centers are equated in a statement by Rabbi Huda. He says, whoever lives in Babylon is accounted as though he lived in the land of Israel. So it's really the same Babylon, land of Israel. And Abaya maintains that Bavel or Babylonia will not witness the sufferings that will precede the coming of the Messiah. So perhaps it has a slightly more privileged status. Babylonia's superiority is defined in at least two ways. So Rabbah and Rav Yosef cite a teaching or a master who says, all countries are like dough, an indeterminate admixture, as opposed to fine flour towards the land of Israel. And the land of Israel is like dough towards Babylonia. What does this mean? This is a way of expressing the genealogical purity of the community. So Babylonia's superiority is defined in at least two ways. One is its genealogical purity. Other nations are like an impure mixture genealogically when compared to Israel, and Israel is like an impure mixture when compared to the Babylonians. But in other texts, Babylonia's superiority is connected to the divine presence. So here we see from the Talmud, Megillah 29a, taking advantage of an earlier teaching that says that the Shekhinah, the divine presence, accompanies the Israelites wherever they are exiled. Abaya and Rava, and even some Palestinian authorities teach here in Megillah that the Shekhinah is currently in Babylonia. They ask, where is the Shekhinah in Babylon? So they've all agreed it's in Babylonia, but where precisely is it? So where is the Shekhinah in Babylon? Abaya said, in the synagogue of Chuzal and in the synagogue of Shaf Yativ in the Hardea. And he offers a verse from Ezekiel. Yet have I been to them as a mikdash me'at, a miniature sanctuary. That's interpreted by one sage as meaning, by Isaac here, as meaning this refers to the synagogue and houses of learning in Babylon. So that is the mikdash me'at. These teachings are related to teachings that locate the superiority of the Babylonian Jewish community in its superior learning. So on the one hand, it's superior for genealogical reasons, or it's superior because God's divine presence is there, or it's superior because its learning is superior. That's three reasons, and I think I said two before, but at math I am no good. So according to a late source here on this slide from Midrash Tanhuma, Noah 3, God transferred the yeshivot from Jerusalem to Babylonia at the time of the destruction, so that the oral Torah would not be forgotten. The text says, and they, the yeshivot, have remained or dwelled in Babylonia with their Torah from that time until now. Neither Greece nor Edom, Rome, has ruled over them, nor have they been persecuted, and they will not even suffer the pangs of the Messiah. In short, the Palestinians may have the land, but the Babylonians have the Shekhinah, they have the synagogues, and they have the study houses. And this suggests that the land is not an end in itself, but a means to the end of a flourishing community built on Torah. When the land no longer can serve that end, because of destruction or persecution, the land is abandoned for another locale. In all of these passages, Babylonia is represented as a site for an authentic and even superior Jewish existence. Indeed, the Bavli also contains traditions that identify a positive purpose for the diaspora, and many of these are reported in the name of Palestinian sages, interestingly enough. So in Tractate Pesachim 87b, Rabbi Elazar says, the Holy One, blessed be he, did not exile Israel among the nations, save in order that proselytes might join them. a view that's reminiscent of Isaiah 55's universal mission. Rabbi Oshaya understands the exile as preserving Israel's very existence. He says, the Holy One, blessed be he, showed righteousness unto Israel by scattering them among the nations. That's what saved us. And when a certain sectarian brags to Rabbi Hanina that the Jews living among them have not been killed, Rabbi Oshaya, and that the Gentiles are very forbearing and tolerant, they haven't killed the Jews among them. Rabbi Oshaya says, it's on the slide here, the reason you haven't killed us is because you do not know what to do. If you would destroy us all, well, we are not all among you. You can't gather us all in one place and kill us. If you were to destroy those who are among you, you would be called a murderous kingdom. Relatedly, Rabbi Chia teaches, the Holy One, blessed be he, knows that Israel are unable to endure the cruel decrees of Edom of Rome, and therefore he exiled them to Babylonia. So again, the dispersion of the nation is represented here as a mercy, as part of a divine plan for the benefit of Israel, or sometimes the nations. Most remarkably, when asked why God exiled Israel precisely to Babylonia, Rabbi Yochanan says in the last passage here, God exiled Israel to Babylonia because he sent them back to their mother's house. It may be compared to a man who becomes angry with his wife. Whither does he send her? To her mother's house. Rabbi Yochanan refers to Babylonia as the motherland. After all, the patriarchs came from Mesopotamia, which is Babylon. Now, earlier we saw a Palestinian tradition that likened residence outside the land to abandonment of the mother, being embraced by a foreign woman. But in Rabbi Yochanan's teaching, when God exiles the Israelites to Babylonia, he's sending them back to their mother's home. And this idea is echoed in a passage that follows by Rabbi Alexandri, who lists things that return to their original home. He says, when Moses smashed the 10 commandments after the sin of the golden calf, the divine words on the tablets were withdrawn to heaven, their original home. Similarly, when the nation was destroyed, the people returned to Babylonia, their original home. This analogy builds on the idea of the land not as an unconditional grant, but as a conditional lease. And if we drive this analogy to its logical conclusion, perhaps Israel's residence in the land is ever and always a temporary and even dangerous sojourn away from the security of her original home, the land between the rivers. In one respect, the land of Israel would seem to have an insurmountable advantage over Babylonia. As we have seen, certain commandments attached to the land, which would suggest that full observance of the Torah is possible only in the land. One sage confronts this issue through the figure of Moses. So according to Rabbi Simlai, Moses yearned to enter the land in order to earn the reward that comes from performing the commandments associated with the land. God replies, is it only to receive the reward for obeying the commandments that you seek to enter? I ascribe it to you as if you performed them. Here again, residence in the land is neither the end goal nor the ultimate reward. At most, it is important because it enables the performance of certain mitzvot. But if intention is accounted as the deed itself, then it's not even required for a virtuous life of Torah. As Isaiah Gafni has noted, with the emergence of a learned and highly competent Babylonian rabbinic class, the rabbis of Palestine would eventually assert that certain central rabbinic activities could be carried out only while physically located in the land. This was part of the competition between the two centers, and they tried to assert their superiority and supremacy. Specifically, ordaining rabbis and declaring the calendar had to be done physically in the land. So in the battle for precedence between the sages of the land of Israel and the sages of Babylonia, the Palestinian sages asserted their supremacy in these two matters of communal leadership over the objections of their Babylonian colleagues. The Babylonian rabbis acknowledged a certain hierarchy of authority, but they found ways to counter the assertion of supremacy by their Palestinian colleagues. In one passage in the Babylonian Talmud, Rav Huna teaches, we have made ourselves in Babylonia the equivalent of the land of Israel from the day that Rav came to Babylonia, a certain founding father, if you will, of the sages. Our final text comes from a work known as the Avot de Rabbi Natan, and it contains a paradoxical assertion of the equivalence between the land and the diaspora. Anyone who is buried in other countries it's as if he were buried in Babylonia. Anyone who is buried in Babylonia, it's as if he were buried in the land of Israel. Anyone who is buried in the land of Israel, it's as if he were buried under the altar, since the entire land is fit for the altar. And anyone buried under the altar, it is as if he were buried under the throne of the glory, as it is said in Jeremiah, a throne of glory set on high from the beginning is the place of our sanctuary. To be buried in other countries is likened to being buried in Babylonia, which is likened to being buried in the land of Israel, which is likened to being buried under the altar, which is likened to being buried under the throne of glory. In other words, this passage invokes a hierarchy that places Israel and its sanctuary at the top, but then undermines that very hierarchy by asserting essentially that burial anywhere in the world is equal to burial under the throne of glory. This is a fitting text to close with because it encapsulates the idea that Israel and the diaspora should not be locked in a zero-sum game. Now, to sum up, we've seen dueling views of the place of the land and the place of the diaspora in Jewish communal life, and dueling views of the possibility of an authentic Jewish life within the land and outside the land. We've seen, on the one hand, the idea of the land as an unconditional and eternal land grant, versus the idea of the land as a conditional abode for the formation of a holy community. We've seen the idea of the land as a unique site for Israel's life with the divine, versus the idea of the land as the site of Israel's arrogant forgetting of God. It's the place where one loses God, doesn't find God, as well as the idea that God is encountered outside the land. The land isn't a unique site. We've seen the idea of the land as an end in itself, a reward for the performance of Torah. We've also seen the idea that the land is the instrument that subserves a greater end, the establishment of a community built on Torah. We've seen that the land is the ultimate linear destiny for the nation, but also the idea that the land is just one stage in a cyclical journey that must include the regular experience of life outside the land. We've seen the idea of dispersion as the nation's punishment and alienation from God, versus the idea of dispersion as enabling the nation's purification or its redemptive transformation. And we've seen the idea of the dispersion as a reproach of Israel, a humiliation in the eyes of nations, or versus the idea of dispersion as the condition for Israel's expansion throughout the globe. So Aleph Beit Yehoshua's categorical rejection of an authentic Jewish life outside the land ignores the rich and complicated history of Jewish reflection on this very, very question, which is to say that the debates and the arguments that engage the Jewish community today have, to a large extent, happened before. What I'd like to suggest is that the way forward does not lie in embracing one vision and erasing the other, embracing one side of the chart that I just showed you and erasing the other in a kind of zero-sum game. The way forward lies in maintaining a healthy balance, a dialectical tension that affirms the essential purpose, the indispensable function, the centrality and authenticity of both land and diaspora for Jewish communal life in the present and for a robust Jewish future. I'd be so interested to hear your thoughts, and thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely phenomenal. Everyone can applaud. Indeed, button. We're all getting used to Zoom now. Actually, Bill Gates took me off from my computer for about 90 seconds there before I got back on. So I apologize for that. But all but 90 seconds of it. And it was a tour de force of biblical and rabbinic sources on this important question. And I love your formation of talking about tension rather than in these ideals. And I've often thought, and I'm happy to hear your thoughts. I'll give some of the questions that have come in. And please, everyone, continue to send me your questions. I'm happy to pose them. That, modern Jewish denominations, and I think of Zionism in a sense of like an Aleph Bet Yeshua. I think of Zionism as being one of those denominations, right? And in the sense of, our ideologies of Jewishness that pick and choose from Jewish traditions to say what's authentic and what's not. And one of the things I try to do, it's the perk that you and I have as academics that a rabbi wouldn't have, is to point out that picking and choose, just the very fact that they've picked and choose, I don't know who's right and wrong. I don't talk to God, but you Reform, you Orthodox, you Zionists, you're all picking and choosing, and just admit that you're picking and choosing, and you're choosing this tradition over this tradition. And I'm sure you must face that same frustration yourself all the time.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think to make it clear that one is picking and choosing, and then make the argument for it, make the best case, right? You can say, I acknowledge this is in the tradition, I acknowledge this is in the tradition, but I think that the salient element or the salient values for the situation today would be for us to pursue this. That doesn't deny the existence of the alternative point of view, but there are all of these particular perspectives served a purpose, served a function, and can promote Jewish flourishing in different circumstances and in different situations, right?
Mm.
I mean, there was a time Ezra probably needed to circle the wagons a little bit, given the historical situation he faced. But in other times, that can create an enclave that is not going to lead to Jewish flourishing. So again, the tradition offers a rich array of resources, and the intellectually honest thing to do, which is what I think you're suggesting, is to say, here is this rich array of resources. Where are we now? What would be something that would promote Jewish flourishing now? Let's find those elements, which is not to say they're the only voices, but they're ones we can make a good argument for being helpful now.
Yeah, I absolutely. Yeah. And also the idea that just to admit our biases, I mean, it's, so like that line from Casablanca. I'm shocked to learn that those living in Israel were biased to suggest that Israel is either today or 2,000 years ago are biased to suggest that the land of Israel is the be all and end all, and that those living in diaspora were absolutely insistent that
Right.
land of Israel is irrelevant, that we are all godliness flows to us.
Right.
And yeah.
Well, and I just want to say, Josh,
nature.
but what's interesting is that in the biblical tradition, of course, really has both of those things. It's a conditional land lease versus it's an unconditional grant. They have the idea that it's a reward. We have an idea that nope, you can live outside the land and fulfill a life of Torah without. It's all in the biblical text. What then happens is how, as you say, different communities will select, so Philo or Josephus ignores those parts of the biblical text that promise land. It's interesting. He describes the covenant with Abraham. The word land it's not there. So it's the filtered reading of the biblical tradition to support the positions started already in antiquity and of course continues to this very day.
Wonderful. All right, so let me read you some of the questions that are coming in from the audience. One of our participants asks about the relevancy of these competing views today in the conflict between diaspora Jews and Israel, and specifically the Orthodox control in Israel on things like conversion and Jewish status, and how you think the text that you've outlined for us today so brilliantly can speak to that conflict. Would you like me to give you a couple, or do you want to, what's your preference? What do you?
Sure, actually that might be smart because it's conscious of time. So maybe that's a good idea.
Let me give you one or two more and people can continue to send them in. That was the first question. Another person asked about you contrasted the land of Israel and Egypt, specifically, Mount Sinai or Midian, where there was a godly presence, and asked whether in the Jewish tradition, the issue of mitzvot, of commandments connected to a specific place, right? There might have been holiness in a place, but were there mitzvot connected to it or not? And how that might play in. And sorry, let me pull one more, make it three seem to be a special number. And to what extent is this tension one of equal choices versus an ideal versus what we're stuck with, right? People sort of making do with what there is, and not being a real equal theological battle. So
yeah,
with
good
those
questions.
now, and if we have time, we'll do a couple more.
Good questions. I might go backwards. Yep, I think that what's interesting is to look at these voices and to try to assess the question, is this sort of we're sort of stuck with a second, but we have to make a virtue out of a vice, right? And so I think, though, I hope that the sources that I presented were making a strong case that this wasn't a virtue out of a vice, right? When you take a text like that amazing passage in Deuteronomy 4 is, you're gonna fall asleep at the wheel. We know what human psychology is like. When life is going well for you, you are sure that it's because you are virtuous. If you're a wealthy person, you're sure it's because you earned every penny. And those poor people out there, they deserve their fate, and I don't have to help them. We know how human psychology works. We give ourselves credit for things that are not of our own making and are not measures of our moral value. And so we need to be uprooted from that. We need that reset button. We need to have things ripped away from us. I mean, this is what, living in a sukkah for, a week, a year is also supposed to do, right? There's just such psychological wisdom, I think, in so many of these elements. So the idea that there is a positive purpose served by the cyclical movement of human generations through different experiences. I think that's psychologically brilliant, and not just a sort of let's make a virtue out of a vice. In the same way, Josephus and others, Josephus clearly sees this through the lens, and Philo too, through the lens of the larger culture in which they live, just as we all see things through that lens of American culture or contemporary European culture, if you're in Europe right now, or Israel. We can't help this. And they saw things through the lens. And at that time, at any nation that could send out and establish, daughter colonies, it was a sign of its great moral virtue and its moral value and its success in history. And they looked around at the Jewish diaspora and said, look at this. We did this even without armaments, without battle. And so for Josephus, this was fulfilling a divine destiny, right? So I don't think it's just a making the best of a bad situation. I think there's a genuine commitment to this as a positive vision for the people, that it starts in this tiny little land, but it's going to expand so far beyond that and fill the world and bring something to it. There may be some of that, but I think there really is a positive vision too. And in terms of the question of, yes, commandments being attached or connected to a place, it's true. And as I continued to speak, hopefully some of that question got addressed a little bit. The point is that claims that one can only encounter the divine in the land of Israel, that's just belied by the biblical text, right? God is encountered in other places, and God travels with Israel out of exile to Babylonia. So that's not true. Now, whether the life of Torah is fully lived only in the land, because it's only in the land that you can observe certain commandments, that's an argument, but it's really interesting. That is an argument that is made in some of the sources. But again, it's an argument that's almost made in the reverse. The text, one of the texts that really deals with it explicitly, is the text where Moses expresses regret that he can't go enter the land and therefore fulfill some of the mitzvot which are attached to the land as opposed to the people. Most of the mitzvot are attached to the people, but a few are attached to the land. And there, the upshot of the text is, it's all right. The fact that you wanted to is enough. But God never requires perfect Torah observance, by the way, right? That's if God required perfect Torah observance, then there'd be no hope for anybody or anything, right? So perfect observance is never the goal. But what one can manage at any given time to the best of one's ability is what the goal is. And if certain things can't be fulfilled, the rabbis have never had any problem with the fact that if you can't do something for some reason, you don't do it. So I think that's a little bit less important. And in terms of today, so the truth is, I try not to talk about anything past the 7th century. That's the postmodern period, as far as I'm concerned. Everything from the 7th century on is postmodern. However, it's true. And you see this in some of the Hasbara even that comes out of Israel. Some of these films that you see where they show empty synagogues or empty shuls in America and say there's no American, right? The shlilat hagalut, right? The negation of the exile, that there is nothing outside the land of Israel, and that Jewish life in America is on a dead end path, and so on. And so that, yes, there is that sort of rhetoric, and that the only authentic life is in Israel. And then I think you also hear the counter charges from non-Israeli Jews, so American Jews, but also some European Jews, that Israelis are sort of perhaps insensitive to their own identity because it's something that they don't ever really have to think about or actively choose or perform. Their Israeliness is given to them and their Jewishness is sort of given to them. And whereas Jews living outside the land of Israel have to have a consciousness of their Jewishness. There's something to that text in Deuteronomy 4, which says, seek me outside the land, because that's going to have to be a conscious choice. That's where you're really going to have to come face to face with who am I, and am I different from others, and in what ways? Israelis never have to do that, right? So there really is a different sensibility on the part of both communities. And when there are different sensibilities, there is always the opportunity for offense. There's always the opportunity for feeling misunderstood and not listened to, and also an opportunity for people to become insistent upon their own truth as the only truth, and to feel that they are defining the terms of the debate. And so we see that sometimes with in this debate. Beyond that, I mean, I think everything is as familiar to you as it is to me. And my hope is that by looking at these sorts of sources, we realize that identity is about narratives, that all of these sources are narrating their Jewishness, they're narrating their authenticity, they're narrating the role of the land in their lives, they're narrating their ability to experience the divine in the land, outside the land, through the mitzvot, whatever it is. And that the more that we can narrate the circumstances of our identity, and the draw upon the richness of the tradition to provide the resources to narrate that identity, I think the greater the chance of understanding. I have always found that in arguments, stories succeed in creating bridges far more than sort of, bullet points of argumentation. But to sort of narrate one's perspective is something that people really have to, well, that's your perspective. That's you can't really negate someone's narration or narrative or story. So I don't know if that's helpful, but I do think it helps to know that in the past people have thought long and hard about how to narrate, how to configure, to even the choice of the word exile versus diaspora. You'll notice I tried to avoid that a lot of times, unless I specifically meant it, like negative exile. Then I would speak about dispersion. So I tended to try to use just the phenomenological fact of people dispersed elsewhere, whether you figure that as a diaspora, colonization, voluntary immigration, or exile in a negative sense. That's part of your narrative, right?
Yeah, thank that. I'm cognizant of time, and I can't imagine a better note to end it on. For my personal goal, and I'm sure one of yours as well, is to push towards pluralism and understanding. And I am a modern, I guess I'm a postmodernist, because I study the 19th and 20th and 21st centuries. So I guess I was postmodern from your perspective. But certainly I'm very interested in the way that people use texts and traditions selectively and to construct their identities and stories selectively, and reminding ourselves that, first of all, in Kol Chadash Tachad Hashemesh, there's nothing new under the sun.
Right.
People have been struggling with this for a very long time. There's a comfort in that. And knowing that there's different traditions on which to rely, and we can both exist in our different denominations, our different expressions, and have on what to rely. That also is a comfort in that, I think. So,
and I think it helps us understand that someone can have an authentic Jewish experience, but that doesn't make it the authentic Jewish experience. So knowing that there have been these different ways to understand things in the past means, yes, I recognize your claim is one that we can find sources for, and it is an authentic, Jewishly authentic narrative, but mine is also, it also has a rich past.
Phenomenal. Well, thank you so much. That was absolutely fantastic. And I thank everyone for coming. If any of you want to watch again, we'll have this uploaded soon. And if you have friends who you think absolutely must watch it, which I certainly do, it will be there for them as well. And thank you again. That was just absolute delight. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. My pleasure. Be well.
I look forward to seeing everyone soon.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Chag Sameach.
Thank you.
Chag Sameach, indeed. Chag Sameach. Chag Sameach. Yes.